The old man finds 3 injured abandoned cat cub in -50-degree blizzard. The blizzard howls through the night, a force of nature no one can survive without help. At -50 degrees, the world outside is a frozen wasteland, where even the bravest would never dare to venture. But amidst the chaos, an old man stumbles through the storm, driven by something deeper than survival, a sense of duty. Through the thick snow, he sees them, 3 tiny, abandoned cat cubs, barely alive, in a world so cold, they stand no chance unless he can save them. In this deadly blizzard, their lives hang by a thread, and only one man can change their fate. In the midst of the worst blizzard in years, the world outside is a frozen wasteland. The temperature is so brutal that any human who dares venture out risks freezing to death in minutes. The wind cuts through the air like a sharp blade, and the snow seems endless, swirling in chaotic gusts. Visibility is nearly zero. The storm has already claimed its victims, and it's clear no one should be out in this kind of weather. But there's one man, an old man, who is walking through it all, determined to survive. His steps are slow, deliberate, the crunch of snow beneath his boots the only sound in the dead silence of the blizzard. His face is covered in layers, only his eyes peeking through, squinting against the piercing cold. The chill seeps into his bones, and with each breath, his chest tightens. But the old man presses on, knowing that no matter how dire the storm, he has a purpose. This old man wasn't always like this. Once, he had a family, a wife, children, a life full of warmth and laughter. But years had passed, and now he's alone, a widower with no one to call family. The years have made him weary, his body frail, and yet, in the face of this merciless blizzard, something inside him refuses to quit. He's lived a long life, and now he faces what could be his final test, survival. But today, survival means something more than just fighting to stay alive. Today, it means making a difference in the life of those who cannot fight for themselves. As the storm worsens, the old man's mind flashes back to the days when his home was warm and filled with love. The memories flood his thoughts, but there's no time for reflection. He's not here to reminisce. He's here for something much more urgent. For a moment, he stops. His heart races. Amid the deafening roar of the blizzard, he hears something faint, something that doesn't belong to the storm. A soft cry, barely audible, but unmistakable, a cry for help. Without hesitation, the old man pushes forward. His legs are heavy, struggling against the deep snow. His breaths are shallow, each one more labored than the last, but he doesn't stop. The cry grows louder, sharper. He's close. The storm makes it hard to see, but then, through the snow and ice, he spots them, 3 small bodies, huddled together, barely moving, their fur matted with ice, cat cubs, injured, abandoned. The old man's heart stops. How could they survive out here, in this brutal cold, all alone? His mind races, his instincts kick in. He moves towards them, his hands trembling, as he scoops up the tiny creatures. Their fragile bodies limp in his arms. His body screams for warmth, for rest, but there's no time to waste. These little lives depend on him. They need him. And in this moment, he knows he must do whatever it takes to save them. The wind roared through the blizzard, relentless and unforgiving. Every step the old man took was a battle against the storm, each footfall leaving a small imprint in the thick blanket of snow beneath him. He had been walking for hours now, though it felt like days. The storm was so fierce it seemed to have swallowed the world whole. The sun was nowhere to be seen, hidden behind a curtain of snow. and wind that obliterated all light, the old man had no way of knowing the time, nor the direction he was headed. The only certainty was the overwhelming cold. Each breath felt like a knife in his chest, the air freezing in his lungs before he could exhale. His hands, numb and stiff, were tightly wrapped in thick gloves. But it didn't help. The cold seeped through. A constant reminder that nature was fighting against him. He could feel the heaviness in his chest, his body struggling to keep up with the bitter, bone-chilling frost that gripped his every movement. It was only sheer will that kept him going now. He had to keep moving. He couldn't stop, not yet. Somewhere, deep within the storm, there was a nagging feeling, a sense of urgency, a pull toward something unseen. He couldn't explain it, but it felt as if something was waiting for him, hidden in the swirling chaos. The thought was strange, ridiculous, even. Why would there be anything out here? Everything in this storm was dead, frozen, untouched, yet the feeling persisted, nagging at the back of his mind. He stopped for a moment, squinting through the blizzard, trying to discern anything through the endless white. All he could see was a thick haze of snow and wind. No more than a few feet ahead of him, his breath came in shallow bursts, a soft cloud of mist forming in the air before quickly vanishing into the storm. He shivered uncontrollably, his knees weak from exhaustion, but he couldn't rest, not now. Then, there it was again, the faint sound, almost imperceptible. It was a cry, a soft, pitiful sound that cut through the wind, something not quite human but full of desperation. The old man froze, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest, the fatigue momentarily forgotten. It was the sound of something in distress, something that needed help. He stood there, listening intently, trying to make sense of it. The wind howled, drowning out most of the noise. But there it was again, a small cry, followed by a weak mewl. It sounded like a kitten. The realization struck him with the force of a lightning bolt. Kittens, out here, in this storm. His pulse quickened, his instincts kicked in, and without thinking, he began moving toward the sound, his legs pushing through the deep snow as he struggled to move forward. He couldn't be sure where the cry had come from. The wind was a maddening blur of white, disorienting him, but he followed his gut, forcing himself onward. Each step was harder than the last. His feet sank deeper into the snow. With every movement, he could barely feel his legs anymore, numb from the cold, but he kept going. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The cry grew louder, more distinct, and the old man could tell it was coming from somewhere just ahead. He was close now, so close. A surge of adrenaline pushed him forward, his breath ragged and uneven as he struggled to stay upright against the storm. And then, through the snow and wind, he saw them. At first, they appeared to be little more than dark spots against the white landscape, 3 small, fragile bodies, barely moving. He approached them cautiously, his heart racing in his chest. The cry had stopped, replaced by the soft sound of labored breathing. He dropped to his knees in the snow, his hands trembling as he reached for the tiny creatures. They were kittens, barely more than a few weeks old, their small bodies frozen and stiff with cold. The old man's heart lurched in his chest as he gently scooped one of them into his gloved hands. It was barely breathing, its fur matted with ice and snow, its tiny limbs stiff and unresponsive. The other 2 kittens lay huddled together nearby, their bodies barely moving, eyes closed as if they were already gone. The old man's breath caught in his throat. How could they have ended up here, abandoned in the middle of this unrelenting storm, with no chance of survival? A wave of panic surged through him. They couldn't have been out here long. No one could survive in this cold for long. The kittens were so small, so vulnerable. If they didn't get help, if they didn't get warmth, they would surely die. But the old man couldn't afford to lose hope. He couldn't let them die. He had to act fast. His breath was coming in sharp bursts now as he scooped up the other two kittens, holding them carefully in his arms. They were so light, so fragile in his grasp. He knew he had to get them out of the storm. He had to find shelter. He had to save them. His thoughts raced as he looked around, searching desperately for any sign of shelter. The storm was growing worse by the minute, the wind picking up and blowing the snow in blinding waves. There was nothing around him, no shelter, no safe place. The old man felt a pang of despair. How could he possibly make it through this storm with these fragile lives in his arms? But then he remembered something. Just a few hundred feet away, he had seen a small cabin on his journey. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He had to get to that cabin. It was their only chance. With renewed determination, the old man rose to his feet. The kittens held tightly against his chest. His legs trembled with exhaustion, but he forced himself to move. Every step was agony. His breath was ragged, his chest tight, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not when the lives of these innocent creatures depended on him. The wind whipped around him, and the snow stung his face like needles. But he pushed forward, his eyes locked on the faint silhouette of the cabin. In the distance, it felt like it was miles away, but he kept moving, one step at a time. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. The storm was closing in, the snow falling faster and thicker. The old man's vision blurred as he struggled to keep his balance, his knees buckling beneath him from the strain. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to. And then, just as his strength was about to fail him, he saw it, the cabin. Through the whiteout, it stood there, like a beacon of hope. The old man's heart surged with relief, and he pushed himself harder, faster, dragging his weary body toward the shelter. His breath was coming in shallow gasps now, but he didn't care. He could see the light. He could see the warmth. Finally, he reached the door. With shaking hands, he opened it. The warmth of the cabin a welcome relief from the biting cold outside. He stumbled inside, barely able to stand, but he didn't care. He gently laid the kittens down on a small pile of blankets by the stove, his hands numb and shaking. As he tried to warm them, he didn't know if they would survive. He didn't know if they were too far gone, but he had done everything he could. He had found them. He had brought them here. And now, all he could do was wait and hope. The storm raged on, relentless and unforgiving. The old man clutched the three fragile kittens tightly against his chest, shielding them from the icy wind that bit at his exposed skin like shards of glass. His breath came in short, labored gasps, visible in the frigid air as small clouds of mist that were quickly swept away by the blizzard. Each step forward was a monumental effort, his boots sinking into the thick snow that seemed determined to pull him under. The kittens were completely still, their tiny bodies limp and lifeless. In his arms, he could feel their faint warmth against his chest, a fragile reminder that they were still alive. Barely. The old man's heart raced as he thought about how little time they had. They needed warmth, shelter, and safety, and the storm was determined to keep all three out of reach. Just hold on, he murmured, his voice cracking. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to the kittens or to himself, but the words gave him a sliver of resolve. He had faced many storms in his life, both literal and metaphorical, and somehow he had always made it through. This time, though, it wasn't just his life at stake. These tiny, innocent creatures depended on him, and he could not let them down. Every step felt like a battle. The wind tore at his clothes, finding its way through every seam and gap to chill his skin to the bone. His gloves, thick and worn from years of use, did little to protect his hands. They were stiff and clumsy, barely able to hold the kittens securely. His face, partially covered by a scarf, burned from the cold, and his eyes watered as he squinted against the driving snow. The old man knew he couldn't stop. Stopping meant freezing. Stopping meant death, not just for him, but for the kittens cradled in his arms. His muscles ached, his joints protested with every movement, and his body begged him to give up, to rest, to let the storm take him, but he refused. He thought of the cabin, the small wooden structure he had seen earlier in his journey. It was still far, but it was his only hope. In his mind, he pictured the warmth of a crackling fire, the safety of four walls, the relief of finally being out of the storm. It was the only thing that kept him going. As he trudged forward, the terrain became more treacherous. The snow was deeper here, rising up past his knees and making each step a struggle. He slipped more than once, his boots losing their grip on the uneven ground beneath him. Each time he fell hard, the impact sending jolts of pain through his body, but he never let go of the kittens, no matter how much he hurt, no matter how difficult it became. He held them close, shielding them from the cold with his own body. The wind howled louder, as if mocking his efforts. His scarf came loose at one point, the gusts tearing it away before he could grab it. The cold stung his exposed face, and he could feel the frostbite setting in. His hands, even through the gloves, were numb and barely functional. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The kittens stirred slightly, their tiny bodies twitching against his chest. The movement gave him a small spark of hope. They were still alive, still fighting. If they hadn't given up, how could he? Fighting against nature. The blizzard showed no mercy. The snow began to fall harder, the flakes coming down in thick, heavy sheets that made it nearly impossible to see. The old man stumbled blindly, relying on memory and instinct to guide him. He knew the cabin was ahead, but he couldn't be sure if he was still heading in the right direction. The storm had a way of disorienting even the most seasoned travelers, and he was no exception. His breathing grew more labored, each inhale a painful effort as the cold air burned his lungs. His legs felt like lead, his knees threatening to buckle with every step. He was exhausted, every ounce of energy drained from his body, but he kept moving, fueled by sheer willpower and the knowledge that giving up wasn't an option. At one point he slipped again, falling face first into the snow. For a moment he lay there, unable to move, the weight of the storm pressing down on him. The kittens were silent, their tiny bodies still pressed against his chest. He could feel the cold seeping into him, the snow soaking through his clothes. It would be so easy to stay there, to close his eyes and let the storm take him. But then he thought of the kittens, their fragile lives, their quiet cries for help. He couldn't let them die. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, the old man pushed himself up, the snow clinging to his clothes as he stood. His legs trembled, his body screamed in protest. But he pressed on, after what felt like an eternity. The old man finally saw it, the faint outline of the cabin through the swirling snow. His heart leapt in his chest, a burst of hope and relief washing over him. He was so close now, just a little farther. The final stretch was the hardest. The snow was deeper here, and the wind seemed to grow stronger, as if the storm was determined to stop him. His body felt like it was shutting down, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. But the sight of the cabin gave him the strength to keep going. Finally, he reached the door. With shaking hands, he fumbled for the latch, his fingers barely able to grip it. After several agonizing seconds, he managed to pull the door open and stumbled inside, collapsing onto the wooden floor. The warmth of the cabin was immediate, though it felt distant and unreal. To the old man in his exhausted state, his first thought wasn't of himself, but of the kittens. Gently, he laid them down on a blanket near the fireplace, their tiny bodies still and silent. His hands, numb and trembling, struggled to light the fire, but he managed it after several tries. The flames roared to life, casting a soft, warm glow over the small room. The old man worked quickly, rubbing the kittens with the blanket to warm them up. He could see their tiny chests rising and falling, though their breaths were shallow and uneven. They were alive, but only just. He took off his coat and wrapped it around the kittens, placing them as close to the fire as he dared. He knew it would take time for them to recover, but at least they were out of the storm. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe. As the storm howled outside, the old man sat by the fire, watching over the kittens. His body ached. His hands and face were raw from the cold, and every breath was a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. But as he looked at the tiny creature sleeping soundly in his coat, he felt a sense of peace. In the stillness of the cabin, he thought about how fragile life was, how quickly it could be taken away. The storm had tried to take everything from him, but he had fought back. He had chosen to fight, not just for himself, but for the lives of these helpless creatures. As the hours passed, the kittens began to stir, their tiny cries filling the cabin. The old man smiled, his heart swelling with relief. They were alive. They had survived the storm. He fed them small drops of water from a spoon, their tiny tongues lapping at it eagerly. For the first time in a long time, the old man didn't feel alone. The kittens were more than just animals. To him now they were a reminder that, even in the harshest conditions, compassion and determination could triumph. The storm had finally passed. Outside, the world was still and silent, the once raging blizzard now replaced by a pristine expanse of snow, glittering under the soft light of a pale sun. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire crackled softly, filling the small space with a comforting glow. The old man sat on a worn wooden chair near the hearth, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing flames. His gaze rested on the small bundle of life huddled on a blanket nearby. The three kittens he had fought so hard to save. They were alive. The realization still felt surreal, as though the entire ordeal had been some fevered dream conjured by the storm. But there they were, nestled together, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each peaceful breath. The old man had spent hours tending to them through the night, rubbing their fur to restore warmth, feeding them droplets of water and bits of softened food. It had been a long, delicate process, but it had worked. The smallest of the kittens stirred first, a tiny mule escaping its mouth as it shifted against its siblings. The sound filled the old man's heart with an inexplicable warmth, a stark contrast to the biting cold he had endured mere hours ago. He reached out cautiously, his large, calloused hand hovering above the kittens. When he finally touched the soft fur of the smallest one, it opened. Its eyes, a pale, icy blue that mirrored the frozen wilderness they had been rescued from. The kitten blinked at him, unsteady but curious, as if acknowledging the man who had saved its life. The old man smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened the deep lines etched into his face. It had been years since he had felt this way, a quiet joy that stemmed not from his own survival, but from the knowledge that his actions had made a difference. He had saved something fragile and innocent, something that might have otherwise been lost forever. As the hours turned into days, the old man and the kittens settled into an unspoken rhythm. The storm had left the outside world buried under thick layers of snow, cutting off any chance of leaving the cabin for supplies or assistance. But the old man didn't mind. He had everything he needed: firewood to keep the cabin warm, a modest stockpile of food, and, most importantly, the companionship of the kittens. Each day, the kittens grew stronger. The smallest one, whom the old man had begun calling Frost, was the most adventurous, often wandering across the cabin with wobbly legs before curling up on the old man's lap. The other two, whom he named Blizzard and Snowdrop, were quieter, content to nap near the fire or play gently with each other. Together, the trio filled the small cabin with life and warmth, their playful antics a stark contrast to the deadly storm that had brought them together. The old man found himself talking to them, his gruff voice softening as he shared stories of his past. He spoke of his younger days, of long winters spent in solitude, of friends and loved ones long gone. The kittens, of course, didn't understand his words, but they seemed to listen all the same, their tiny heads tilting as if to say, "We're here now. You are not alone anymore." Late at night, as the kittens slept soundly in their makeshift bed, the old man often found himself lost in thought. He would sit by the fire, staring into the flames as memories and emotions surfaced. The storm had been more than a battle against nature. It had been a test of his will, his capacity for compassion, and his resilience. There had been moments when he had wanted to give up, when the weight of the cold and the fear of failure had nearly crushed him. But something had kept him going. Perhaps it was the faint cries of the kittens, their desperate pleas, cutting through the howling wind. Or perhaps it was the realization that life, no matter how small or fragile, was worth fighting for. In saving them, he had rediscovered a part of himself, a spark of purpose that had been buried beneath years of solitude and hardship. The kittens had reminded him that, even in the harshest conditions, even in the face of overwhelming odds, there was still room for kindness. There was still hope. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between the old man and the kittens grew stronger. He marveled at their resilience, their ability to adapt and thrive. Despite their harrowing start, Frost, Blizzard, and Snowdrop brought a sense of routine to his days. Their playful energy a constant reminder that life, even in its simplest forms, was a gift to be cherished. The old man began to notice changes in himself as well. He felt lighter, as though a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. His days no longer felt empty or monotonous. Instead, they were filled with moments of quiet joy, watching Frost pounce on a loose thread, listening to Blizzard's soft purrs, feeling the gentle warmth of Snowdrop curled up against his arm. He began to wonder if the storm had been more than just a natural event. Perhaps it had been a turning point, a chance for him to reconnect with the world in a way he hadn't thought possible. The kittens had given him that chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. As the snow outside began to melt, and the first signs of spring appeared on the horizon, the old man started to think about what came next. world beyond the cabin was waiting, and he knew he couldn't stay isolated forever, but the thought of leaving the kittens behind was unbearable. They were his family now, his responsibility. He decided he wouldn't part with them. They had survived the storm together, and they would face whatever came next together as well. The old man began making plans, thinking about how he could provide for them once the snow cleared. He would build them a proper shelter, perhaps a small addition to the cabin. He would gather supplies, ensuring they always had enough food and warmth. The kittens had given him a new purpose, and he was determined to honor that gift. One evening, as the sun set over the snowy landscape, the old man sat by the fire with frost, blizzard, and snowdrop curled up around him. The cabin was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the flames and the gentle purring of the kittens. The old man leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing as a sense of peace washed over him. He thought about the storm, the struggle, and the rescue. He thought about the moments when he had nearly given up, and the moments when he had found the strength to keep going, and most of all, he thought about how far they had come together. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the soft presence of the kittens, the old man realized something profound. Life was fragile and unpredictable, but it was also beautiful and worth fighting for, and sometimes the greatest joys came from the simplest acts of kindness. As the kittens stirred and snuggled closer, the old man smiled. He had found something he hadn't even known he was searching for: companionship, purpose, and a renewed appreciation for the quiet beauty of life. The storm had brought them together, but it was their shared resilience and love that had carried them through. And as the old man sat there, watching the firelight dance across the walls, he knew one thing for certain: they would never face the cold alone again. As the seasons changed and the snow melted away, the old man often found himself watching the kittens play outside the cabin, their joyful energy a stark contrast to the frozen, lifeless landscape of that fateful storm. In their survival, he found a renewed sense of purpose and a reminder of the resilience of life. The storm had tested his strength and resolve, but it had also brought him an unexpected gift: companionship and hope. With frost, blizzard, and snowdrop by his side, he knew that even in life's coldest moments, warmth could always be found in acts of love.